So I hope you can see the screen. Thank you, Graham, for bringing the screen. So just to say, so my parents were medical missionaries in Nigeria. For the most of their 18 years in Nigeria, they were based right up in the northeast of that country of Nigeria, in very, very close to Lake Chad. Lake Chad was the size of Switzerland in the days that my parents were working there as medical missionaries. And my dad and mum will never ever say this to anybody, but it's my delight to be able to say, and you'll be embarrassed now, Dad, when I say this, but a few years ago, my father and mother, both of them individually, were awarded the MBE from the Queen. Yes, it's there you go. Sorry, Dad. I know you don't like me to saying that, but yeah. So, and they were awarded the MBE for medical services in Africa, and they spent 18 years in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria in 1964. It makes me 60 now. I look much younger, I know, but I was born in 1964 and was brought up. Went to boarding school in Nigeria till I was 12. Then we came back to the UK as a family. From Nigeria, met Lesley eventually, married, was ordained as a church minister, served in the church in Lancashire for a couple of years before we were sent out by the same mission as my parents had been with. We went to Nigeria and then to Ghana for a total of 8 years. And then we came back to the UK, and I was then for the next 19 years I was pastor of a church in Fleetwood, in Lancashire. And then after 19 years, the congregation were saying, Stephen, isn't it about time that you retired and moved on? No, they didn't actually, which is very, very gracious of them. But after 19 years, we just felt that it was the right time to step out of that church leadership role, and felt the need for just a bit of a break from ministry and from work, etc. And so it's been a dream of mine for many, many years to drive across the Sahara in a Land Rover. My dad and mum had a Land Rover when I was a baby in Nigeria, and so I grew up with Land Rovers. And we had an old 1985 Defender, and the chassis was beginning to rot quite terribly on this Defender. And so I eventually bit the bullet, took it off the road, and took everything off the old chassis, skipped the old chassis and got a new galvanized chassis and rebuilt the Land Rover and to make it into an overlander to take us to Cape Town and back. It took me 7 years to bring the thing to pieces and to rebuild. I think I've got a picture here. So there we go. That's our old Land Rover. It was in slightly better shape than that when we set off from Cleveleys in 2017. Our son has bought that Land Rover from me now, so it's still in the family. And like any good vehicle, it has a name. And so we called this Land Rover Mr Baggins, or Bilbo Baggins. And partly because I wanted to go there and come back again. So there and back again. Bilbo Baggins. Took me 7 years, half a day here, a day off there, a Saturday somewhere else. And Lesley thought that I would never ever finish this Land Rover. She thought that she was safe from being in a Land Rover for 12 months with me, with a roof tent on the roof. But when we got about 6 years in, she began to think, this is going to happen. We are going to be going across Africa. So just a few pictures here. There we go. So the one on the left-hand side is a road of sorts in Morocco, and we crossed the sea from Spain to Algiers in Morocco. And that was our first African country on our safari. And Morocco is beautiful. Tangiers? Tangier. Tangiers. Tangier. Clathorpe. Yes. So yeah, on the left-hand side is Morocco. On the right-hand side is a road that is north of Nairobi, heading up to the border with Ethiopia. And we had been told by other overlanders as we were making our way south and then north again, that this road to the Ethiopian border was the worst road in Africa. And so full of corrugations, and if you've ever driven on a corrugated road in Sudan, Brian, or anywhere else, corrugations on a dirt road are horrendous. If you've got cavities and fillings, your fillings literally drop out of your teeth. And so even worse, even worse than potholes here. In fact, potholes in Africa, many places, you actually drive into the pothole, you drive along a little bit, and then you drive back out again. They're that big. So when we got here to this road, we thought, this is not the worst road in Africa. And it's actually, I think this is the best surface road I have ever driven on in the whole of my life in any country. And the Chinese had, I think about 6 months before we got there, had built this brand new road. It was beautiful. So that was on the right-hand side is Nairobi, is Kenya, heading towards the Ethiopian border. And then we drove through quite a number of countries. And Botswana in the southern Africa is probably Lesley's favorite country with regard to driving through and spending time in. Botswana has a no-fence policy for its game reserves, and so there are no fences, which is very unusual in Africa. And so the wild animals, whether it's elephants or giraffe or whatever, they just literally wander as they will all over Botswana. And you can be driving along a normal tarmac road, and you come around a corner, and literally there's an elephant right in front of you. And it got to the point after several days in Botswana where we were saying, oh no, not another elephant, as we came round the road. So on the left-hand side there's Mr Baggins, and that was our roof tent that we still have, or Sam has it now. And so we spent most of our 13 months driving across Europe and driving across Africa, sleeping on the roof in that roof tent. And it was wonderful. That's Lesley there. She was rather embarrassed that I would be showing a bunch of men her bare legs on Saturday morning, but please don't tell her that we spent too much time upon that particular photograph. And I think that the road on the right there is probably my favorite road that we drove on in those 13 months, again in Botswana, and it was just mile after mile of deep sand with no corrugations and no potholes, just deep sand. And I think we saw in 2 days of traveling on that road one other vehicle in 2 days. It was absolutely wonderful. And this is, so there's Lesley. And so we basically cooked out of the back of the Land Rover. You can see the little 2-ring stove in the back there. I built the Land Rover with a stainless steel water tank, 40 litres of a water tank, and then also an extra fuel tank. Had a little fridge inside it as well, and it was very basic, but it did us very, very well. In fact, I am amazed, because literally I think every nut and bolt I took off that Land Rover and then replaced it as I rebuilt it over those 7 years. I'm amazed it actually got to the ferry in Spain, let alone got to Cape Town and back again. Just let me just say, do you believe in angels? You don't need to answer me, but do you believe in the existence and the reality of angels? I always have believed in angels, but our driving through Africa has convinced me of my belief in angels. I've never been aware of seeing an angel before, physically, But there was an experience when we were in Nairobi during this trip where if I have been encountered by an angel, then this very big, very black Kenyan would be an angel. And conversation with him out of the blue in Nairobi changed the course of my life in 2018. And that conversation was quite out of the blue, phenomenal, just to confirm something for Lesley and I with regard to our future. And from that conversation, I was encouraged to press send on my application to the mission that sent my parents and then sent Lesley and I. And so we got back, and I was appointed director of the mission. But it was that conversation with that very big, very black Kenyan that convinced me to press send on my online application. But that was our kitchen. And then, almost at the end of the pictures here, this is Sudan. And we, left-hand side there, we were driving from Sudan up to the border with Egypt along the eastern, quieter route. And we were driving for 2 or 3 days from Khartoum to get to Egypt. And again, we hardly saw any vehicles in traveling, just really wonderful. And so as we're coming towards the evening, we're about a day's journey from the border with Egypt. We just pulled off the road, drove about a mile into the desert, and then just camped behind a little sand dune in the desert. And the right-hand side, when the sun was about to go down, was a picture there. And I exaggerate not, for the time that we were there, early evening until the following morning, there was not a single bird, there were no mosquitoes, there were no flies, there was not a single animal, no creature, no ants, no wind, no noise, no light pollution. There was absolutely nothing. And you can just see on that left-hand side picture, just for mile upon mile upon mile of featureless, utterly lifeless desert as far as the eye could see. That was our very quietest night in 13 months as we crossed Africa. And then here's, that was our route. We had a satellite tracker to keep our family aware that we were still alive. And so you can see we crossed there from Spain, drove the way through, all the way to Nigeria and the Cameroon border. And just here, this is the border of Nigeria with Cameroon. And we got there with our visas for Cameroon, and were informed that there was fighting in Cameroon. And so we weren't allowed to cross. The border was closed. We waited for 2 weeks at the border there. It was still closed, and eventually we had to drive back to Lagos. It took us 2 weeks to organize a container, and we put the Land Rover onto a container, and it sailed down without us to Cape Town. We flew to Cape Town and then drove back from Cape Town up the eastern side of Africa to Egypt. There and back again. I kept a journal every day. So we did 40,276 miles in 13 months. I also kept a journal of how many liters I put in of diesel. 5,001. That one is very important. 5,001 liters of diesel. We drove through 15 European countries, 21 African countries, without a single puncture on the Land Rover. I had 2 spares, never ever needed to use them. Murphy's Law, if I hadn't have taken any spares, I'd have had a lot of punctures. 2 spares, no punctures. And do you know, every country in Europe, apart from the UK, every European country and every African country, diesel was always cheaper than petrol. There's only one country, in my understanding, that diesel is more expensive than petrol, and that's the United Kingdom. I don't know why. I think it's taxes, but exactly, yeah, it's very frustrating, but there we go. Let me tell you a story, 2 stories, just to head towards a landing. So as you've heard, my parents and then Lesley and I, missionaries in West Africa for some years. And then now as the real privilege of being a director of a missionary sending agency. And this maybe have about 140 missionaries, presently speaking, and they're in 5 continents of the world. And our missionaries are working with the local church, both in sending and receiving countries, to plant the church amongst unreached, what we call unreached people groups. And these last years, I've been hearing story after story after story after story of what many are calling a wind in the house of Islam. A wind in the house of Islam. These last 25 or so years, since the turn of the century, Muslims across the world have been coming to Jesus in faith and obedience, large in their tens and hundreds of thousands these last 25 years. And the significant means of Muslims coming to faith in Jesus as Messiah and Lord is through visions and dreams that they receive. And I remember reading the story of one Muslim background believer, a Muslim who had come to faith in Jesus, and he said that our regimes, our Muslim countries, can close the borders down, can stop people from reading the Bibles, can refuse there to be churches in their country, but there's no regime on earth that has the power to stop people receiving dreams and visions. And it's phenomenal. This is one of my favorite stories of that's happening again and again and again. 2 missionaries were driving their vehicle through northern Iran. And their vehicle was filled with Bibles, which they were taking to deliver secretly to somewhere further north in Iran. And as they were driving through the mountains of Iran, and windy mountain roads, suddenly the steering wheel of their vehicle that they were driving jammed. And so the driver slammed the brakes on, because otherwise on one side there was a great big cliff drop down, other side a cliff going up, jammed his brakes on, came to a shuddering halt on the side of the road with his steering wheel jammed, dust swirling all around the car, hearts were beating away. And as they were gathering their breath, there was a knock on their car window. They wound the window down. There was an elderly Iranian Muslim man standing there. And he just said to them, "Have you brought the books?" And they asked him, "What books?" And his reply was, "Have you brought the books that Jesus told me to come down the mountain from my village to stand here to wait for them to arrive?" And as these 2 astonished missionaries asked him how had this happened, several nights previously, this elderly Muslim man in his mountain village had received a dream in which Jesus came to him and said, "Come, follow me." Now, he woke up the next morning wondering about this dream, to discover that every other person in his mountain village had had the same dream that night. Jesus had come to them in their dream and said, "Come, follow me." Now they all said, "We don't know who Jesus really is. How do we follow somebody that we don't know?" The elderly man, I think the next night, went back to sleep. He had a second dream that night in which the same figure, the same man, Jesus, came to him and said, "Go down tomorrow morning the mountain path to the road, stand there, and the books that will teach you how to follow me will arrive." So he went down the mountain path, stood there, and the next little while this car stopped, filled with Bibles. The 2 missionaries gave the Bibles to the elderly man, and that was how they learned how to be discipled as followers of Jesus. And this story like that again and again and again. It's quite phenomenal. As I thought about that, so these last 25 years, it's been documented by various mission theologians and mission leaders that there have been more Muslims come to faith in Jesus Christ as their Lord and as their Savior in these last 25 years than in all the previous 1,500 years put together. That's amazing. And often it's through dreams and visions that they're first brought to Jesus. And I think to myself, Lord, that's wonderful that is happening. But what about the ordinary church, if you like, here in the United Kingdom? Why are we not seeing things like that? And sometimes that worries me. There've been all sorts of different responses in response to that question. But God is still very much, He is, even today, especially today, a God who wants to speak to people and reveal Himself to people as being God, as being Lord, as being Savior of the world. And a couple of years ago, my brother-in-law, who is still in the church in Fleetwood, where we were for many, many years, he came to our home to visit us, Lesley and I asked him, "How's the church going, Peter, in Fleetwood?" And so he said, "It's really very encouraging. Ever since you left, Stephen, it's been very, very encouraging." So, and he told me a story about a person who I call 316 Dave. And so Dave is a Fleetwood man. He's very, very well known in Fleetwood, 28,000 of a population. He's a very tough individual. He's a motorcyclist, and he's a very well-known figure in Fleetwood as being somebody who's tough, who's a biker, etc., etc. And he said this Dave had no knowledge of Jesus, wasn't at all a Christian, wasn't a churchgoer, had no faith. He was just an ordinary British white man and a hard man. I met him just literally about 2 months ago. He's covered in tattoos, all down his arms, on his neck, everywhere else. And I wouldn't want to meet Dave on a dark night in Fleetwood if he was upset with me. But so Peter said to me, Dave was in his garage during COVID lockdown, and he was working on his motorcycle all by himself in his garage in Fleetwood during lockdown. And suddenly, out of the blue, Dave had this overwhelming sense of evil that was in the world, wrongness, and he literally fell to his knees. This tough, hard, tattooed motorcyclist fell to his knees in his garage with this overwhelming sense of just evil across the world. And he called out in his garage, "If there's a God, show yourself to me." And nothing happened. He got up and finished his work in the garage. He went to bed that night, and he woke up in the middle of the early hours of the morning, and he looked across at his digital clock, and it just said 3:16. So he thought, that's strange. He went to the loo, came back to bed, slept again. The next night, exactly the same thing happened. He woke up, unusually, looked at his clock, 3:16. This happened 3 nights. I don't know why it's always 3, but 3 nights in a row, 3:16. And then he thought, maybe this is the presence in my garage 3 days ago trying to get through to me. So he took out almighty Google, Googled 3:16. And the top hit, of course, was John 3, verse 16. He read John 3:16 from Google, and he thought, this must be the God who is trying to get through to me 3 days ago in my garage. He went to church. Ended up he and his wife at the church where I used to be pastor. And as they walked through the doors of our church, evidently, his wife just burst into tears and said, God is here in this church. And I met him 2 months ago. We went for a church, a child blessing. And this is, and I was so pleased to meet Dave, who I call 316 Dave. And this, there you can see his tattoos, yeah? And this shirt that he's wearing here, he's had made several T-shirts with the cross on it, with John 3:16, the text on it. And he wears this most days throughout Fleetwood. He's known in Fleetwood.
How old is he?
No, I never asked him that question, but what age do you reckon he is, looking at him? I would say what? About 40? 43? Yeah, anywhere between 40 and 60. Let's be safe. I think it's probably around about 50 is Dave. Met his wife as well at the church there 2 months ago. And they are just, both of them, really growing in their relationship with Jesus as Lord and Savior. So what God is doing through dreams and visions to Muslims, He's also really concerned to reach out to all of us with the reality of the good news that Jesus Christ is God. And John 3, we know the verse so well. For so did God love the world, that He sent His Son, that whosoever believes in Him shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. And I'm so grateful to be in a church that believes in this Jesus, and working for a mission agency that is sending missionaries from the UK across the world to see the Church of Jesus Christ planted amongst those who don't yet know Him for themselves. So there we go. And I think it's 9:15. So I think breakfast is due, isn't it, Graham? Any time now.